Good morning. Thank you. And first, I'd like to thank Tan Sri Michael for inviting us to this session. This is a very critical session, and I have all our speakers has been introduced. We'll start with, the first of all is that you have heard about this morning where the economy is heading, and when you look at the new normal, post-COVID new normal, in the first last 2 years, we were trying to grapple what is the new normal. And we look today, if we look back in our 1998 financial crisis, we had some scarring of the economy, deep scar. The last crisis, every crisis leaves us with some deep scars. And those deep scars continue until today. If we look at the way the economy has evolved, we were having like 9% before 1998. Post 1998, we were, for the last 20 years or so, we're just moving around 4%, 5%. And the days of 9%, as at that one stage, we were among the few countries that have the highest economic growth in history. They call the Asian Tigers. So, but the 98 crisis left us with some very deep scars. And now, COVID-19 is also a very big crisis. It's a health-induced crisis. We are not sure how deep the scar of the crisis will be. So it is a work in progress. So I think the government, as we heard this morning, is trying to do their best. So number two is the issues of, today, Tan Sri Wahid is listening. The stock market has been in red for the last 3 days. We are facing, I've never experienced in my living memory so many challenges converging together, from interest rate hikes to potential recession, to stagflation, to supply chain disruption, to the geopolitical risk that is going on in Ukraine, leading to many other unintended consequences. And also the slowing down of China, which is our major export because of the COVID policy. So as a country going through this new momentum of growth, we are facing multiple challenges together. So, and this topic, although a session is focused on productivity, competitiveness, and the minister talked about structural reform that we need to do, and we have heard about this. Tan Sri Andrew and I was in the Economic Council 10 years ago. We've been talking about structural reform. We have not seen so much progress because of many events that happened within the last few years. I would like now to hand over, so we have some very eminent person. They are friends, we know each other for quite a while. And I would like to hand over to Tan Sri Andrew Sheng. He has distinguished credential, and would hand over for him to give his view on the way we move forward in terms of structural reform, productivity, and also competitiveness. Over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Qasim. It's been wonderful seeing you again. And you've summed up the situation very, very clearly. The minister and Tan Sri Wahid give some very, very good opening statements. This session is really about structural issues, so it's not the near-term issues that we're concerned about, although that's extremely volatile. The real issue is structural. How do we deal with these structural trends that our economy is facing? And I'm very grateful you reminded me that in 2010, when we started looking at some of these issues, the structural issues have not been addressed. And this happened because I just looked at the 12th Malaysia Plan, and I just want to spend a few minutes reading what was achieved in that 11th plan. And how does the EPU in the 12th plan look at the challenges? And then we sit back and think through the short-term issues. Let me very quickly run through the short-term issues. Malaysia is the luckiest country in the world. The world is just recovering from a pandemic. The war is on. Our palm oil prices are highest ever. Our oil prices are highest ever. Our electronic factories are running at capacity. Our exports are booming. Why aren't people happy? That's a structural issue, right? So let me now, move to the 12th plan, selected targets, okay? The GDP growth, the selected targets, in fact, if we really look at the overall performance, the target plan is to be somewhere between 4.5 to 5.5. The actual achievement was 2.7%. The GNI per capita, that's gross national income per capita, is supposed to be 57,882 during the plan. We only achieved 42,000, right? The labor productivity growth, the plan is 3.6%. Our labor productivity growth per annum at the moment is 1.1%. 1.1%. I mean, that speaks it all when you're talking about a growth rate of 4.5% as a median target compared to the old days of 8%, then lower down to 6%. And now, we're happy with 4%. But if productivity growth is only 1% and population growth is also 1%, it's not surprising that the annual monthly income per household is only 7,160 compared to the target of 10,000. Now, if you look at the 11th plan, the number is staggering. If you really look at some of these growth, which is all in the 12th plan, by the way, okay? The average growth of real private investment went down from 6.1% to 1.2%, all right? Consumption, average private investment in current prices went down from 252 billion to 233 billion. Private sector has no confidence. This is the serious issue. The average growth of real public investment went down. The average growth of real private consumption went down from 6.8% to 4.7%. But guess what? The average growth of real public consumption went up from 1.4% to 3.2%. So the state is growing bigger and the private sector is stepping back. All right? So that's a fundamental, structural issue. But hello, if the private sector is doing badly or doesn't feel that much confidence, what is happening to exports? Our exports are growing. It went down from 7.5% growth in 2016 to 4.8% in 2020. But in trade balance, went up to 185 billion ringgit, right? And the current account has gone up from 2.5% of GDP to 4.3% of GDP. Now, if your current account is going up, your exports are growing up, why is your ringgit depreciating? Okay, so it's a really strange issue. And yet the fiscal spending, the fiscal balance is now, deteriorated from -3% to 6.2%. We understand that. The state needs to do short-term change. So all this can be read in the balance of payments. This is the Bank Negara latest review, right? Our current account, in 2020 was 6 billion surplus, all right? Current account, right? And 2021 estimated 53.5 billion. All right, the capital account is slightly negative. The financial account was actually negative, so that we end up with an overall balance in 2020 of minus 19.3. But in 2021, our surplus is now 45.6% overall balance, 45.6 billion overall balance. This is huge by any numbers. But guess what? the reserves have not increased that much. The net errors and omissions are 36.7 billion ringgit. And so therefore, even though we are, earning in exports, we are actually, the capital outflows is significantly larger. So then we have to start looking at the productivity issues. I'm sorry, I'm spending a little bit of time on this. Our 10th plan productivity was supposed to be 5.3% growth. We only achieved 2.7 in the 11th plan. But private sector labor productivity went down from 1.6% to 0.4%. And why is that? And that's because, according to the 12th plan, 10% of our labor force is dependent upon foreign labor. And the reason why we have current inflation right now, anecdotally, I was shocked when a friend of mine in manufacturing told me that during the pandemic, 2 million foreign workers left the country. According to the statistics department, overall, during this period, roughly 600,000 foreign workers left this country. I don't know who's right or wrong. But the structural issue in this country is that productivity has not gone up. We rely on cheap foreign labor. We export our talented labor to all our neighboring countries. We have Indonesia, 277 million people, Vietnam, 100 million, Philippines, 100 million, growing at 5%, moving to 6-7% in the Malaysian 80s period, because their demographic endowment is now taking up. Their policies attract foreign labor, attract foreign investment. During the US-China spate, the commentary by Bank Negara even said this, I beg your pardon, this is the World Bank. Vietnam benefited from this. The shift of foreign investment out of China went to Vietnam much more than in Malaysia. So structurally, we are placed in a beautiful sweet spot of the fastest growing region in the world. We have lots of natural resources. We can grow in the green area, but our private sector has no confidence. I mean, that's the bottom line, okay? And so if this structural mindset that we are going to stimulate the economy only through the state, it's going to be, horrendous. I picked up with a table that truly shocked me, okay? And this is the 12th plan GDP by state. During the 11th plan, Sabah and Sarawak GDP growth per annum during this whole period, when Malaysia on the whole was growing 2 to 3%, in the 11th plan, Sarawak was growing at, Sabah Sarawak were growing between 0.6 to 1%. I mean, are you surprised that some of the richest natural endowed population in Malaysia with the low population has the slowest growth when we are a rich country? Now, this regional imbalance, all the structural imbalances I talked about, have been openly discussed in our 12th plan, etc. But how we really talk less and act more on the ground to rebuild our economy is going to be the challenge of this generation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you later on the question-answer session. Some of the issues will be raised later, and I will hand over to Dr. Where's the next speaker? Is Jomo. Are you on the line? Okay, over to you, Dr. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamza, and thank you very much to KSI for this kind invitation to join you today. Let me take off from where Tan Sri Andrew left off. I think he laid out the issues. Emphasis is on restructuring issues, which are medium-term, longer-term issues. And I think it's important for us to recognize that many of the problems we face today go back at least a quarter of a century. Basically, with the Asian financial crisis in 97, we had a response which basically accepted premature deindustrialization. So rather than keep up the effort to continue industrialization and try to have much more indigenous or autochthonous industrialization, we celebrated it and turned a problem into a benefit and said that we are moving to the tertiary level of development into services. But when we look more carefully, we find that the services we went into were largely traditional services rather than modern services. And they were largely government services. The number of people in the public sector actually doubled from 850,000 when Tun Mahathir stepped down the first time to about 1.7 million. The number, and then the other thing, of course, which was heavily emphasized, were finance-related services. Undoubtedly, there was some growth of that, but it wasn't all that much. Now, we have been in a situation where, financialization in the world has significantly increased. And we have tried to sort of half-heartedly, often, try to right that, but without a very clear and pragmatic strategy. If you look, for example, at the Capital Market Master Plan and the Financial Sector Master Plan almost 2 decades ago, there was a very unclear and ambiguous attitude towards how we ride the financialization wave. And of course, as Tan Sri Andrew knows much better than any of us, financialization itself has been episodic. It has changed very significantly over the last few decades in very, very important ways. Another issue which I think needs to be emphasized is the whole question of our attitude towards fiscal issues. We have wanted to be, the government has been wanting to be relatively popular, and macroeconomic or fiscal populism in this country expresses itself by reluctantly increasing taxes and shifting the tax burden from direct taxes, income tax, wealth tax, and so on, to indirect taxes, consumption tax, and value-added taxation. On the spending side, we also find that since the 1970s and the early 1980s, we have seen a relative decline in public spending, which can be a very good thing. But unfortunately, what we have seen is a decline of public spending has also been directed towards populist ends. And this, of course, has introduced a whole range of problems. So as our late friend Ismail Saleh pointed out a long time ago, the actual impact of the tax system in Malaysia is actually regressive. And as Jacob Meerman showed quite some time ago, on the spending side, on the public expenditure side as well, we find that spending has actually also been regressive. So both on the taxation side as well as on the spending side, we do not find a progressive fiscal role. Now, I think the key issue, as correctly pointed out, and as the subsequent two speakers will be, they are both experts in the area of labor, and so I won't dwell on that too much. But I think we have to recognize the fact that a lot of our labor data and a great deal of our productivity data is actually quite misleading. I think it was Minister Richard Rayat in around the middle of the last decade who commissioned an estimate of the number of foreign workers here. And the number of foreign workers at that time was estimated to be about 6.7, using telecom estimates. It was estimated to be about 6.7 million. Now, at that time, if you look at the labor data, what you find was that there were about 15 million people in the Malaysian labor force, of whom 13 million were citizens and 2.2 million were foreigners. In other words, 4.5 million of the foreign workers were not even recorded as foreign workers in this country. In other words, 2/3 of the foreign workers were not even recorded and recognized. And those numbers basically imply that 1/3 of the labor force constituted foreign labor. Now, it's anybody's guess whether how the numbers have changed in the last 7 years or so. But I think it's very important to recognize that the presence of foreign workers and the contribution of foreign workers has huge implications, and we do not have any serious grasp of the issues. The pandemic could have been used to get a firmer grasp of these issues, but unfortunately, this was not done. So that's as far as foreign labor is concerned, but I think it's very important that since our official statistics exclude foreign workers, especially the undocumented foreign workers, we have actually very misleading labor statistics. The other point I think which needs to be made is that by excluding the presence of undocumented foreign workers, by not taking into account the role of non-citizens in the Malaysian economy, our estimates of productivity are grossly distorted. They simply do not reflect what the actual situation is. The other point, of course, to take into consideration is that the way many of our services are measured, and I particularly want to emphasize the so-called modern services, the single largest contributor to modern services is actually public employment. And how is public employment productivity measured? It is measured by the remuneration and emoluments given to the workers. So you have a tautological situation where you presume that their contribution is reflected by their income. But we also know that for populist political reasons, especially in the last decade and a half, we have seen a significant increase in the emoluments for workers in the public sector. And so not only in terms of the doubling of the size of those employed in the public sector, but also other kinds of things, usually before general elections and so on and so forth. So the consequence of all this is that we actually exaggerate the productivity of labor in the public sector. And this, of course, is problematic. And how do we measure productivity in say, financial services? It is the share of income which accrues to the financial services. Is that an accurate measure of this? I'm sure all of you remember what Paul Volcker used to say, that the only major contribution which he felt from financial innovation in the last few decades has come from the introduction of the ATM card. In other words, a lot of financial income accrues to finance for all kinds of reasons, including property rights and so on and so forth, rather than because of the actual contribution to productivity. So I think we have a range of issues which we need to address. There are a whole range of other issues, of course, which have been raised, and I'm sure will be raised in the future, but I think I've exceeded my time, so let me stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Joe. I think those issues are quite related to the next speakers, Dr. Sekaran, on the TFP productivity is also has been a major issue for the many years, and the foreign labor has a huge impact and the way on productivity. To a certain extent, it has undermined our productivity in the many years, in spite of all the effort to do automation, and also with the digital blueprint coming on for the next few years. What are the rest of the issues are you going to cover on the TFP on productivity stuff that has been lingering for many years?
Thank you. First of all, let me thank Tan Sri Michael and KSI. Also thanks to Dr. Hamza Kasim for raising some very interesting and rather difficult questions. to a large extent, I think I'll be guided by the previous speakers who I think have very comprehensively and very made very acute observations on what has been done, what needs to be done. Before I come to the question of productivity, I think I'd like to touch a little bit on what Dato' Hamza Kasim started off by saying. And he said that with every crisis, or every crisis does leave some scars. And that's true. But as much as the crisis leave scars, I think that there are also some lessons that we very painfully have to take home. For instance, with the 97-98 crisis, we learned that it was absolutely essential to develop financial resilience. We needed to have the preconditions in place before we could tackle greater financial openness. And 2008 too taught us similar lessons. The COVID period, which was initially, or what started off as a public health crisis, then blew into economic crisis. Fortunately, not too much of a financial crisis or collapse. But I think it has also taught us a lot of important lessons. Some of these lessons need not have been learned as a consequence of the crisis. I think it was very clear to all of us that the public health system could have benefited from greater efficiency. As someone who uses the public health system, or if you are someone who uses the public health system, you could see that it's overstrained on any normal day. And I think it's these observations that need to be worked on in the first instance, rather than waiting for a crisis to blow up. And then discovering that the health system is inadequate. And there are a whole lot of things that can be done about the public health system, from its the way it's spread out, its access, the queues that you have to go through, the manner in which data is transferred. So there are a whole host of things that can be done at first sight. And I think in that respect, for instance, transportation, connectivity, if you are someone who uses public transport, then you would realize that there is something that can be done about it. And I can go on to give a long list of such issues which potentially could be bottlenecks to growth and to development. Another issue, I mean, since Prof. Jomo has mentioned it, is the question of foreign labor. And what are we doing about it? So I think the first thing that needs to be done is to come out with a catalog of outstanding issues that need to be resolved. And I think that's where you start, with a catalog of these issues, and then go on to possibly suggest what can be done. And I think that's what was wonderful about the new economic model and the first volume that came out. It had quite a damning list of issues that needed to be attended to. And if you have the, so to say, the ecosystem in place, then I guess you are better equipped to deal with any crisis. And I think there are always crises lurking around the corner. There's quite a bit of speculation that you probably could run into, the US at least could run into a recession, a stagflation in a year, in 2 years. And one wonders what the consequences would be for a country like Malaysia. And then, of course, there is, as Dato' Hamza has mentioned, there is, of course, the problem that comes out of China. Our number one trade and investment partner, and China is not going to have the kind of growth that it has been having over the past 10 years. You're not going to see 9% coming out of China. China is going to have a growth rate which is probably closer to the US. Probably something in the region in the upper 3% or so. And that spillover is going to affect us. And who knows what will happen about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Could probably go on for a year. And there have been reliable Russia watchers who say that it could probably go on for 2 years. So as Dato' Hamza has mentioned, you have probably more problems that have and could probably also crop up have occurred in the last 2 years or so, and which could continue for the next 2 years. What's the way out? I think one is we have to have an eye on risk, detecting risk, managing risk, and monitoring the way in which risk evolves at the firm level and also at the national level. And then I think the next thing that we have to look at is to come up with a list of issues that need to be attended to. And I think top of the head, I would think that education, training, infrastructure, and that includes connectivity, the use of technology, and digitalization, and so on and so forth. And I think because we had some of the, to illustrate at least one of these issues, I think it's because we had a reasonable network, we had reasonable connectivity. We were able to adopt digitalization, which cushioned some of the impact of what happened during the crisis. Might not have been perfect, but we went ahead. I mean, there was education that was going on. Manufacturing was assisted because of digitalization and so on and so forth. So there's education, training, there's connectivity, and I think we also need to look at technology. I think these are some of the key issues that need to be looked at. And of course, what are we going to do about our social safety nets, about health financing? So that's a quick menu of the things that we need to be looking at. And I think in the course of looking at these things, you would then be able to come out with some kinds of prescriptions on what can be done about productivity and how productivity can be enhanced. There are of course measures such as total factor productivity, but then I think it's important to keep in mind that when you're looking at total factor productivity for a nation, that's a useful measure to gauge how the country as a whole is doing. But you also have to keep in mind that it's not the government that is being productive or not productive. Your real productivity is what is going on at your office, it's what's going on at the factory level. And it's at this micro level that you would have to be looking at the kinds of changes that need to be made. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sekaran. I think the issues that you have raised is very important. The question is, we have multiple issues to handle, and about sequencing, which one to do first. And the whole idea is that, you know, the capability of managing economy in a crisis that is continuing for the next few years, whether we have the institutional capability and competency to manage an ongoing crisis. If you look at the banking sector, where I'm also part of the banking sector, that, you know, we learned a lot from the last crisis in 1998, 99. There were restructuring of the banks. You find that out of the many banks, there are only a few left because of the consolidation. And 2008 crisis, financial crisis, the bank is also not impacted. And the recent COVID, the bank is very healthy in spite of all the, compared to the other sectors, the bank has been, because they have huge risk management, governance, and a strong regulator who prepared the bank to confront all these crises. So the financial sector is one sector, but as you see, this, which Sheng was saying, that, you know, the COVID is a creative destruction. It has destroyed certain sectors of the economy, and probably new emerging sectors have been doing very well, that the tech sectors. But if you look at the tourism, the airline, so the recovery will come in, but probably in different form. But this is what you see, the lesson learned. Hopefully that we draw those lessons, and we probably you know, help us to find the right pathway. I probably hand over.
Thank you, Dr. Datuk Hamzah. I'd like to thank KSI for the opportunity to share my thoughts. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll take up the issue on structural issues within trade, because that's my forte, trade, to look at it's an old issue that's resurfacing even before the pandemic, which is the depth of trade linkages. Allow me to throw some numbers. Our GVC participation, global value chain participation on average for the past 2 decades is at 65% of total exports. Now that looks like a reasonable number, but when we deep dive and we look into backward linkages dominate. That's about 39% on average over the same period, but forward linkages have increased. Do we get excited about this? Forward linkages have increased from 18% to 29%. When we look at where are these forward linkages, they're just basically with the region, with the ASEAN region. So they're not beyond the ASEAN region. And forward linkages, if we look at forward linkages, the regional value chain only makes up 17% of total GVC. So this data is very telling. It tells us that the manufacturing sector is actually globally oriented, which means that we have to be resilient to shocks. And have we been? We have seen we have not. Before even the pandemic, during the US-China trade wars, we talked about global supply chain disruptions, skewed concentration on certain markets, and how when essential goods are blocked, how it affects the rest of the manufacturing sector. That's the first issue I'd like to bring about. The second, this just tells you that we are still caught at the place or what we call close to the middle stage of the supply chain, or still at the assembly side. This is an old story that has been there for more than a decade. And what does it tell you is that industries are stuck in or trapped in the learning stage. They are not able to move from the learning stage to the innovating stage. While we grapple with some of these issues, I liked what was actually written in the My Digital. We talk about, there's so much being said about low digital adoption, low digital literacy, firms are not upgrading. And if you look at studies done, even foreign firms, we used to talk about technical efficiency to be higher among foreign firms relative to local firms. But we did a study and we thought that's a thing of the past, which means foreign firms, that gap in technical efficiency between local and foreign firms has narrowed drastically. Are we saying that foreign firms are less efficient? It could be just that they are not transferring that technology, they're not interested because of other problems within the domestic economy, such as low absorptive capacity, low skills, and so on. So how do we move from here? This is where I think digital trade is very, very important. Digitizing, something that is easily said because digital adoption is slow, not just in the private sector, especially among the MSMEs, it's also low among the public sector. And this is where the My Digital initiative is quite good, because it acknowledges the fact that the public sector has low digital adoption. We did a study on the ASEAN Seamless Trade Facilitation Indicators, that's phase 2 with AREA, and a few things came out from here. A lot of time we hear businesses saying that, agencies are not going cashless. There's still a lot of documentation involved. So we looked at, one of it was on e-payments. Yeah? We looked at a lot of these agencies with AREA's help. Most of them have gone cashless, but there are some that do hybrid, but there are still some agencies, such as if you're looking at getting lot certificates, for vaccines and plasma-derived medicinal products, you still need to do over-the-counter cash payments at that point in time of our study, which is just 1 month ago. So they may have improved. I stand corrected on that. But most other agencies have gone cashless. But is this sufficient? The second thing we looked at, e-identification and authorization. This is very important because we cannot only look at this authorization or authentication just from a domestic level. We need to also look at it from a regional level, because we will be eventually trading. We need to make sure that our digital frameworks are there's some form of interoperability in our digital frameworks. A lot of people have thought about RCEP. Now, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, while many have looked at it as a form or a platform to push this agenda, we need to also recognize that RCEP has a lot of provisions that are non-binding and enforceable. So would it be the right platform? So in terms of digital adoption, there is some progress, but again here I would say one thing that is very telling, that if you look at within customs, it's the customs clearance function on the national single window, which has been put on hold. And we need a system, I don't want to mention that system that has been currently put on hold. We need a system that can fully support end-to-end document exchange to help our businesses. Now, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, if you see, and also in the case of Indonesia, I had an opportunity to listen to a webinar. It was extensive, the use of blockchain technology to actually integrate and interface different stakeholders, such as port operators, customs, and also freight forwarders. It's amazing. We were at the forefront at the national single window, but somehow we sort of regressed slightly. So comes to my third point. Allow me, Dr. Hamzah, just to conclude with the third point. I've looked at the My Digital Economy Blueprint. As usual, the policies are extensive, but I found something that is quite lacking. At the same time, we want our companies to go abroad. Digital trade is the buzzword and is the way to go for all companies. There's lack of emphasis, although we recognize cross-border trade flows. If you look at Thrust 6 of the plan, build trusted, secure, and ethical digital environment. And the fourth objective is on ensure cross-border trade flows for commerce are seamless, safe, and secure. My concern is here, there's not enough emphasis on cross-border trade flows. Cross-border trade is going to boom. It's going to increase phenomenally, exceeding even tangible goods. Today, trade is not about products, services, it's about data. So how is our local framework going to cope with this? And this is where I would like to draw and highlight. I was just reading an article which is very interesting on the US approach, the China approach, and the EU approach to digital framework to make it to have a seamless kind of trade. And what was important in this is that very often in Malaysia, we think of digital framework in isolation, but we must understand digital trade means we need to integrate. Those frameworks need to align with others. And if we look, otherwise we will not have access to and we cannot control the technology. And this is where I've seen businesses bringing up time and time again, what about technology choice? What about source code and algorithms? And when I looked at these issues, that's when I recognized my digital framework is very extensive. Have we given enough time to think about it? Internet access and content regulation, such as network neutrality, something that people avoid because it means impartial transmission of data, irrespective of the source, destination, the user. Now, if you look at the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand, they sort of, the terms in that agreement is rather laid out in a very soft manner. It's not strong, it's not explicitly stated, so they're careful, but they recognize the importance of network neutrality. Second, intellectual property and innovation. There's always this fine balancing act, and this is where I think businesses need to come in and engage with the stakeholders. How do we draw this digital framework to fit their interests? Because everyone wants to protect IP, especially, let's say, the US, which is right because you need to protect and reward investors. But at the same time, that could choke technology transfer to some extent. So where do you find the balance, let's say, between IPs and supporting new players? Where do you find the balance between prohibiting source code disclosure versus algorithmic accountability? So if you do not allow source disclosure or you prohibit, then others do not have access to the technology. But if you allow, there's a check and balance, there's an accountability when you make predictions. Let's say if you use artificial intelligence to make some predictions. So there are a range of issues. You talk about e-commerce. Is there connection between the national single windows? Yes, your national single window is in operation, but is there interconnection between that national single window? In DEPA, in the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, it's amazing. The national single windows are already connected. There's full document-to-document exchange. So my question on this, my Digital Economic Partnership, while they address a lot of these initiatives, I think one of it is the digital framework is very, very important, because if you subscribe to the fact that digitization, digital trade is the way to go for businesses to engage. We already saw the rise of e-commerce, which is just one part of the story. Then we need to engage regional agreements, look closely at how the developments are taking place, and whether RCEP is the issue. Why would Singapore go just within a small group of countries to address such issues? So Malaysia may want to look at this with major trading partners. With that, I'll stop here.
Thank you, Evelyn. It's a very interesting, very important subject on trade platform. You know, during the COVID, we have accelerated digitization very fast. I remember in the bank, we've been trying to do digitization very much, but the COVID has accelerated because people would not to go to the bank anymore. They also were worried to even touch the ATM machine. So it was a very advantage for the financial industry to accelerate digitization. But when you come to issues of framework, the problem is, as we shift from a tangible economy to an intangible economy, it's all driven by legacy institution. And that's where we have all the problem in the world. I think Andrew Sheng knows about this, that our institutions are still legacy institutions, which were created during the old economy. And their mindset, their institutional framework, competency and capability are all stuck in the old economy. And that's why there is a crisis every other time, because that shift from the intangible to the tangible economy is a huge shift. And I think the capacity to do that is to require resetting all our institutions. And that's where this frustration we have now. So on the micro side, I think you touched a very important issue about on the, we are not strong in microeconomics because the enterprise is very key in terms of driving productivity. And you look at, in terms of, in the 70s, 80s, the infusion of the FDIs into this country actually has a huge diffusion of technology to the SMEs, making many our SMEs as part of the global production network, and some adopting best practices. But as we go along, that diffusion, post-crisis in 1998, 97, there is a collapse of FDIs, and there was very little infusion of new technologies to our SMEs. And that's led to some of the stagnation you find in our manufacturing sector. So thank you very much. We now will take questions from the floor. I'm sure there are some burning questions that we'll address to the panel. I was asking Cik Zahidi whether he has any question before. So, well, is there any question from the online? Okay, you want to send me some question before I ask my some question? See, I can read. There's a long question there. Can you open it again? Sorry, this is digital. Yeah, this is on. Okay. In RMK 11 and 12, we have identified the structural issues and outlined the strategies to be implemented, but why we are still stuck. Is the implementation not done correctly and coherently? Strategy is to increase technology adoption, still lack of funding. It's all about, the implementation. What are the, we have many plans. We are good at doing the planning, and we were discussing that, the capability to execute and to implement is a different competency, but I will leave it to the panel. Any of the panel want to take this question? Yes, Dancy, Andrew.
Thank you. I think the panel discussion was excellent, but it highlights the structural issue that the first anonymous question asked. We have perfect plans. In Malaysia, I cannot fault any of my digital RM, the Malaysia plans, etc. Let me give you a summing up of what the EPU in the 12th plan said about issues and challenges. They said there are 8. On the 6th one is actually the limited gains from global value chain, which Evelyn has talked about. I don't want to get into that. But the first 5 sets out the structural issues very, very clearly. So EPU sees the issues very clearly. Number 1, low productivity among micro, small, and medium enterprises. Number 2, low quality of investment. Number 3, slow structural economic transition. Number 4, widening development gap between states. Number 5, low share of compensation of employees. Issues, policies, everybody understand. Very high level, exactly like the UN, SDG, social development governance issues, or ecological social and governance issues, right? But God is perfect. The devil is in the details. Vision without execution is delusion. We are not implementing. Why aren't we implementing? Dr. Hamza put his finger on it. We have inherited legacy institutions, which in the face of massive digital, geopolitical, climate change issues are having difficulty translating these policy goals into concrete programs and projects that are able to deliver the goods to the people and show up in the productivity numbers, the higher share of compensation of employees, reduce the development gaps between the states, etc., etc. Now, the point that I want to make is that implementation can only happen as a partnership between the state and the bureaucracy, the civil service, the private sector, and the civil society like NGOs. including the universities. We cannot say it's somebody else's job. We never sat down in this country, to a large extent, to sit down and say, given the existential complex changes around us, where are we going as a nation, right? And as I've tried to point out, we have huge opportunities with this green, ecological, social justice, move. Irrespective of what's happening at the geopolitical level, the opportunities for Malaysia sitting in one of the most pristine, or no longer pristine, but the major tropical rainforests, marine reefs, relatively low population in the fastest growing region in the world, with Silicon Valley of Southeast Asia sitting right in Malaysia. Why aren't we grasping all these opportunities? And the answer, it's somebody else's job. Okay, the state blames the private sector. The private sector says, you don't have the issues, I can't deal with this. My point is the structural bottleneck is a mindset problem. As long as we have this legacy mindset, is that somebody else will do the work, nothing will happen. Okay, but you go to Indonesia, you go to Vietnam, you go even to Philippines, you go to Bangladesh, they are moving ahead irrespective of these massive social challenges that they have. Now, if they are 100 million plus population, growing at 5, 6, 7, 8%, whilst we are happy with 4%, and our population growth is 1%, and our exchange rate still appears to be depreciating. How can we compete? We will only be marginalized in this geopolitical strategic game. So whilst the opportunities are huge, the structural imbalances that, really in my view is mental, because we have all the physical goods, there are resources in this country, there is the talent in this country. How do we mobilize that is the real crux faced in this country now. And that's why this conversation must begin sooner than later. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is any other panel? Jomo, you want to add anything to this?
Thank you, Dr. Hamza. Let me support Tan Sri Andrew's very important intervention. I think we have an opportunity, despite all the problems which we face, and I agree about the prognosis of a so-called perfect storm affecting the world economy and including ourselves. But I think we have not really grasped the opportunity offered by the Sustainable Development Goals and the possibility of a Green New Deal. And I think that Tan Sri Andrew hit the nail on the head. There are two aspects which I just want to comment on in the time available. First, we have the whole question of sustainability. There are huge opportunities, but there are also huge problems which we face. A lot of the so-called CPTPP opportunities in terms of trade was actually involve things like importing much more cars from Japan and importing plastic waste from Japan, from Singapore, from Australia. Is that progress? I'm not so sure. 85% of the plastic waste which we import actually goes into landfills. Only about 15% is actually processed. So I think, and if you think about the Menteri Besar of Kedah saying that the future is no longer rice as far as Kedah is concerned, but we should move towards developing rare earths in Kedah, basically undermining the water source for not only for Kedah itself, but also for Seberang Perai, for Penang, and so on and so forth. These are very, very important issues which we don't have a proper discussion about. On the other hand, I think there are two huge opportunities which we have not really taken advantage of. Even going back to the 1980s, Dr. Hamza, you remember this when you were in ISIS. There was a great deal of talk. Tan Sri Augustine Ong and Tan Sri Yusof Basiron were talking about the development of palm oil-based biodiesel. We have basically dropped out of the picture as far as palm oil-based biodiesel. The world has been shifting increasingly towards biofuels. A major commitment was made in the North Atlantic on the western side, bioethanol, on the eastern side in Europe, biodiesel. We have not been part of that discussion. We have not seized that opportunity. Yet another example is the whole question of photovoltaic solar panels. The first largest producer in the world today is China with over 70%. Korea produces 7%, Malaysia produces 7%. But unlike the other two who are producing mainly for domestic use, we produce mainly for export. Now, why are we not using much more of this? You know, in Indonesia and elsewhere, we have seen how photovoltaic solar panels floating on bodies of water have been used to reduce evaporation as well. There's a lot of innovative stuff which has been going on with the use of solar panels, but we have done nothing. We are the second largest producer in the world, but we have done nothing in terms of actively promoting the use of photovoltaic solar panels. So I think there are huge opportunities there. And the other problem, of course, is the whole question of equity. A great deal of the dissent in this country is over equity issues. Unfortunately, for all too long, we have defined and understood equity issues essentially as inter-ethnic. But the real equity issues in this country are essentially those of working people. And over 3/4 of the working people of the labor force in this country are actually wage earners. Very few, only less than half of the labor force is actually covered by EPF. And we have seen how the EPF savings have been devastated. So we really need a new deal for labor. And this will have to improve working conditions, and we have to be much, much stricter. But here we have all kinds of people just jumping into the bandwagon, issuing licenses to Bangladeshis and others to bring in labor and so on and so forth. This is something which needs to stop. It's not that I think it would be disastrous to expel foreign labor in the present situation. But at the same time, let's face it, agriculture in this country would collapse without foreign labor. There are many other sectors in this economy which would collapse. But there's absolutely no reason why we cannot do labor-saving technical change, which would basically allow Malaysians to work much more in decent work conditions. So I think Tan Sri Andrew's proposal is something which we should really seriously consider as a nation. It's part of the restructuring strategy, and this I think is long overdue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, as Jomo was saying, I was a student of technical change and economic growth in the 90s, and when you look back, you look with some sadness because that in the 90s we prepared some fantastic plan as part of Vision 2020. But if you're looking at this, at the rate we are going, I was reading the World Bank report a few days ago, it takes us another 42 years to reach the GDP per capita of Singapore and 23 years to reach the GDP per capita of Korea. That's how long for us if continue to do what we are doing. And normally I like to show this to, when I give a talk to some of the, I'm a young professor at UM, give talk to some of the graduate students, and I will show that, you know, we have great vision. We have the vehicle that we are trying to get there is a Proton Saga. We need a Ferrari to get there, but the problem is we have the old car trying to reach the vision, and it will take another 40 years. What we need is a Ferrari that can take us in 10 years, and that's not happening. And that will only happen if we need a revolution or on the institution, you know, in terms of resetting the institution, in terms of really a big change that it's like a COVID. It's sort of a disruptive, institutional disruption that we need to get there. And that's require strong political will. The way that Indonesia is doing, for example, they are banning oil, export of palm oil because they want to force the palm oil companies to go downstream and do value added. So sometimes state intervention, very strict discipline, sometimes that's what Korea does, is very strict discipline, doing the tough choices. And otherwise, if you leave to market forces, laissez-faire sort of intervention, you will never get things done. And that's why we can talk the same stuff in the next conference. Also, it's the same. Do you want to add anything? No, I've sort of, yeah.
Just a quick one to add. I agree with Tan Sri and Prof. Jomo on implementation gap. There's always been an issue of an implementation gap earlier, as we mentioned, and even in the case of digital frameworks, I suspect this gap will persist and even become bigger. That's one key point. And the second one, I just want to mention, when I read one of this World Bank reports, and they talked about structural transformation in Malaysia, they did a very detailed study, and what they noticed is that it's driven largely, the reasons for the lagging labor productivity growth in Malaysia is that it's driven largely by within sector labor productivity growth and not due to productivity because of labor allocation to productive sectors. So what's happening in short is that we see labor reallocation to less productive sectors. This got me thinking when I relate this to the policies. When you look at some of these policies, as you progress from one policy to another, there are new industries being listed. So at the end of the day, I wonder, which is the priority now? You have so many new industries coming. I'm not suggesting picking winners as the path for transformation that has led to failure, as we have seen based on history. But when you have so much of policy spread out, and they all address certain industries, and at the end, when you put everything together, it looks like it's back to square one. It's all about a broad coverage without depth. And I see this as one of the issues here.
Yeah, we got 5 minutes more. What I will do is to give, yeah, sure.
I just want to respond to one or two of Dato's points. He's, as always, very provocative and I think at times a little too drastic for me. But I'm afraid there are some things on which I have to agree with him. Number one is, I think we have to change the way we do things, the way we look at things. And I think the world is moving in quite a different direction than we are prepared to go. Just a couple of examples to illustrate what I mean. For instance, if you looked at the way the tech industry has evolved in India, it's one of those areas over which the government has had very little to say or do. It used to be basically a planned state, but there are some industries which have done extremely well, perhaps because there was no planned intervention. And two of those areas are, of course, the tech industry, which initially was heavily concentrated in Bangalore, and Hollywood. I think Hollywood was too radical for the government to get involved with, and as a consequence, they've become a global player. As far as the tech industry is concerned, a company like Infosys, for instance, is not terribly impressed with the kind of degrees that you have. It doesn't matter whether you have a degree in history or in maths or computer science. When you come in after a number of interviews and tests, etc., you have to go through their training, their own training, which is, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months. And they make you ready for work. And that training is perhaps more important for them and for you to perform than whatever degree you have already obtained. Take that a step forward. And if you looked at what's happening, for instance, at IBM in the US, I think something like 56% of the jobs there don't need a degree. And increasingly, kids in the US, they're doing without a 4-year education, and part of it is because it's terribly expensive. You have to, it's terribly expensive. You have to take a loan, you have to service the loan, et cetera, et cetera. And they're deciding to go straight into the industry without having gone through an expensive, painful 4-year degree. And most of the tech companies in the US, I'm told, are not terribly bothered whether you are from Stanford or Clemson or Illinois State University. All they're interested in is whether you can do the coding, the programming, and that's very much artisanal. And I think that is also the point that Dato' Hamza is alluding to. He points out that you have the intangible economy and the tangible economy. And a lot of exciting things are happening in the intangible economy. And I think we need to equip ourselves to get into that space of things. And perhaps the old way of doing it is not the best way of doing it. If you looked at 12 Malaysia plan, it's about, I don't know, 550, 600 pages long, which would take an awful lot of time to read. And I don't know how many people, aside from the consultants and perhaps the minister himself, how many people would have read it?
I don't think they read it. But yeah, I need to close this. We have time now.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
You know, as Prof. Evelyn was asking me whether she wanted to touch on corruption or not, I said no. Probably I'm also board of the anti-corruption board. But, I must say that things are. If we start to do things that are happening now, I'm quite optimistic because we have this anti-hopping law in Parliament soon. We have the political financing law that is supposed to be in drafting. And also we have this Fiscal Responsibility Act that is coming in soon. The fiscal, I think if we have time, I want to ask, but we don't have time to ask Jomo and Tan Sri Andrew Sheng on the Fiscal Responsibility Act that would allow us to enable us to, to manage the tight fiscal space we are already in, looking at the revenue and expenditure, and also the development on the separation of powers between Attorney General and the Prosecutor General, which is also some of the major reform we've been working for the last 15, 20 years. It's happening now. We hopefully, before election, that many of these draft laws. So it's a huge impact on the governance issue. So we got many things to discuss, but I think in summary, we are looking at, it's a complexity that we are managing a very complex environment that we have never had this experience before. And many of you have seen, in the COVID-19, how it changes our life, our behaviors, and not many people are enthusiastic to come back to work. They still like a conference online like today. But I think the new normal will be different, and we are going through these changes as we go along. But some of the structural issue has been, talked about in the 11-12 plan. I think if we continue to talk, and as Tan Sri was saying, we need to act, and that act require institutional capability, competency. Basically, we have a capability gap both in government and the enterprise. And if you don't manage, this is a topic where I normally speak on the development of dynamic capability. That is a huge capability gap that we need to invest in building at an enterprise level and at the government. If we don't address this now, we will continue to be lag behind. I was always happy to go to ASEAN and speak at their forum. Today I feel a bit not so enthusiastic because they are moving ahead of us, and we have been left behind as we discussed. So it's an urgent issue. I like to thank all the distinguished panel for a great job, well done. Give them a round of applause, and thank you for your patient listening to this complex issue of economic growth and productivity and sustainability of structural change. Thank you.